In Atlanta, Georgia, in the middle of June 1923, Fiddlin' John Carson made the first country music recording. He was 55 years old at the time. Today, this kind of music is called old-time music, but that label and many others were thought of by record company executives who were trying to sell this newly recorded music. As described by the sociologist Richard Peterson, these executives were also the ones who decided to separately market the music made by white and black musicians. The label country music was not common until the 1940s, and by the 1970s, country and western, or C&W, had faded from use, although my own parents, who were born in the 1940s, sometimes still used this label. In the 1920s, many cultural elites expressed dismay about this emerging style of music. At the time, American popular music was distinctly urban and sung by classically trained singers. It often featured brass bands. It was also mixed with jazz. This newly recorded country music was rural and sung by untrained singers who often had high-pitched nasal voices. The music also evoked images of farm life, family, and old-fashioned values, not to mention sexual double entendres. So as country music emerged as a viable commodity, it produced tensions between urban and rural identities. Then, as now, these tensions were part of the struggle to control the dominant culture in America. The appeal of early country music was thought to be rooted in authenticity. But what is authentic? As this music gained momentum, record company executives sought out traditional folk musicians. Even at that time, these musicians were thought of as novelties. Keep in mind that true folk music is music of the folk, or the people. So this was music that was known by an entire community or people of a given region. It's similar to how most people in America know Christmas carols today. So these folk musicians probably knew a body of songs that were commonly known in their respective areas. For consumers in the 1920s, historical accuracy was not important. What was important was their idea of the past, whether it was correct or not. From the mid-1920s through the early 1950s, some of this folk music failed as a commodity, and some of it succeeded. The result of this trial and error was the creation of the idea of authenticity, a kind of authenticity that could be socially agreed upon through commodification. In a sense, the authenticity of country music was negotiated in part by performers, businessmen, and consumers. Compared to jazz and rock music, it took longer to work out the aesthetics of country music as a distinct style. Here again, this was due to the tensions between urban and rural identities. Record company executives were urban, modern, and well-educated. They referred to early country music as hillbilly music, directly referring to the people of the southern Appalachian Mountains. By hillbilly, they meant rural, naive, and uneducated. The consumers, or rather the main audience for early country music, were the descendants of poor rural Southerners. Richard Peterson characterizes their worldview as dualistic, populist, individualist, and fatalistic. So if he is correct, they saw things as either good or evil, without any mixture of the two. They perceived a struggle between themselves, as the working class, against the powerful elite. They stressed independence and self-reliance, yet they had feelings of resignation as fate dictated future events. While this characterization may be too reductive, it is fascinating to consider how this worldview has been expressed in different ways over many years through country music. In the 1920s, publishing houses and music organizations in New York City dominated the music industry. ASCAP, or the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, excluded country, blues, and jazz composers through the 1940s. The labor union, known as the AFM, or the American Federation of Musicians, excluded musicians who could not read musical notation. So country musicians, who were amateurs or semi-professionals in those days, were relegated to the South and Southwest. Richard Peterson describes 4 primary venues for early country music. Community dances were one venue, even though musicians did not make much money. One example is of Fiddlin' John Carson. He was asked by a farmer to play for a dance, but Carson did not like him, so he asked for $15, an unusually high fee. The farmer still accepted, so the usual payment must have been much less. Despite the low pay, these dances did help young musicians to gain experience. Fiddling contests were another opportunity. This tradition dates back to the 1700s. By the 1880s, there were a number of well-known competitions. The prize was a gold coin or a valuable musical instrument. Street corners provided an opportunity for busking. The musicians who performed in this context were often blind. They sang topical tunes of the day, along with sentimental ballads, while accompanying themselves on the guitar. The other main venues for early country music were social, political, and commercial events. Even Fiddlin' John Carson performed at store openings and political rallies in the 1890s. Here is one story from the son of Gid Tanner, another major performer. He recalls that on those Sunday mornings in the early 20s, when it was too wet to plow, he and his father would take a wagon to Atlanta. Some merchant would ask Gid for a fiddle tune in front of his store. People would gather, and the crowd would grow so large that it blocked the trolley tracks until a policeman came to break it up. This story is a good example of the value of live music. We still understand this today, even though we are constantly bombarded with an array of stimuli in our daily lives. Given the intensity of modern entertainment, a large crowd may not gather for something as simple as a fiddle tune in front of a store, but live performances still attract many people. To me, this is proof that there is no substitute for face-to-face interaction. Another kind of popular event was the medicine show. In the fall, after the cotton had been harvested, people had more money to spend. Many early country musicians, including Roy Acuff and Bill Monroe, would appear in blackface and perform. Of course, today, this kind of stage persona is considered incredibly racist. The pay for these musicians was fair for a young person in those days, plus they also got a bed on the traveling medicine show wagon. It is important to know that in those days, women who were musicians were mostly relegated to the church and the home with their families, as it would have been considered improper for women to perform in these contexts. Turning back to that first recording of Fiddlin' John Carson in 1923, the man who produced and released that recording was Polk Brockman. He was a talent scout and recording director for OK Records. As described by Peterson, Brockman's innovative 5-part system of production is significant as an influential business model. For recordings, he would release only small amounts of many different musicians. He would then focus on successful musicians. As mentioned by the historian Ivan Tribe, Fiddlin' John Carson made well over 100 recordings between 1923 and 1934. For radio, even though there was no program just for country music at that time, musicians would perform live to fill time between other programs. Fiddlin' John Carson used this role to his advantage as a performer on WSB, the first big radio station in the South. Carson had learned to play by ear, so his flexible approach worked well in this context, since he could play for as long or as little as he was needed. He was the first country musician on WSB. He had a colorful persona, as he liked to be drunk and chewing tobacco while performing. Touring is another important aspect of Brockman's system. While recordings and radio appearances did not generate much money for musicians, the promotion from those two sources made touring fairly lucrative, since musicians could charge admission for their concerts. Before Fiddlin' John Carson made a name for himself, he worked in a cotton mill, as a moonshiner, making illegal whiskey, and a house painter, among other things. But his recordings, radio appearances, and tours helped to make him a full-time professional musician. Another part of Brockman's business model was song publishing. This was innovative because the existing model was based on Tin Pan Alley in New York City. That approach relied on musical productions, commonly known as musicals, to make songs popular. Then sheet music was printed and sold. Brockman's approach was to transcribe the songs himself, writing them down from recordings as he heard them. Then he would sell them as sheet music. Of course, to do this, a song must be copyrighted, turning it into marketable property. The idea of copyrighting these early country songs was new. Working within the oral tradition of the day, many musicians would have their own songs that in reality were collages of current elements. Copyrighting a song meant that technically it could no longer be used in this way. The last part of Brockman's system was songwriting. He would commission songs from non-performers, which separated composition and performance. Taken as a whole, he made early country music a system of specialists that made up a commercial enterprise. With all of this work, you might think that he himself enjoyed the music, but the opposite is true. First and foremost, he was a salesman. He even describes himself as an accidental preserver of American culture, flatly stating that my interest in hillbilly music and black music is strictly financial. He also said that I don't ever look at a thing as to what I think about it. I always try to look at it through the eyes of the people I expect to buy it. My personal opinion never enters into anything I ever have anything to do with when it comes to merchandising. Brockman catered to poor people's tastes because it was their purchasing power that made him successful for a time. He was also very kind to the musicians who recorded for him, both white and black. Unfortunately, he failed because he was too focused on short-term revenue. He also alienated songwriters who felt that their songs were not recorded well and failed, or they felt exploited if a song was successful. Despite Brockman's failures, he will always be regarded as one of the first men who helped to establish country music.